You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Red Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right. Every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man is here to talk about the recent news from the last few weeks. We've been trying to follow the news, but it's been a bit tough. It's my job, but there's so much depressing stuff out there. It really is rough to sit with it for so long, but we move forward as there's much to be done. And as always, when we're Han Solo, I've got some great episodes of Talking Headways coming up that I'm going to share with you guys. Last week, we chatted with Kyle Paoletta about his book, American Oasis. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. It was a fun book to read, a fun thing to discuss with him. Some really great stuff from him on the cities of the Southwest. The book's really interesting because there's a lot of history in there. There's a lot of history of cities I didn't understand or know, especially in the Conquistador era, in the time that Albuquerque came up, which, by the way, is an older city than like the Phoenixes of the world. And so it was interesting to hear from Kyle, who's from Albuquerque, on that. We've also got Kelly Porter from Fort Worth's transportation department coming on. Kelly has worked in Houston, Austin, and now Fort Worth. And we talked for almost 2 hours because it was so interesting and fun to chat with him. I'm not going to post all of it as a podcast at Talking Headways, but probably half will be a bonus episode for Patreon members. So look for that as it comes out. Oh, and if you guys are Patreon members, we've created a podcast feed in there for paid supporters. So you don't have to listen to the ads. I know that that's sometimes frustrating for folks that don't want to listen to automobile ads or other things that they just don't want to listen to. So we have a feed now that is no ads. You'll hear my ads for the scarves and things like that, but you won't hear any outside ads. I should say that. But you can get that by becoming a Patreon member. Even $1 a month, you can get the RSS feed to get no ads, because you guys are doing so much for the show by paying monthly for supporting. So we appreciate that. And so I'll put something in the show notes basically that shares how that works, how you can go on to your Patreon membership and figure that out. And it comes up in your podcatchers just like it would otherwise, as you get it. It's just an RSS feed. At the moment, I'm reading Just Action by Leah Rothstein and Richard Rothstein. We're talking to Leah on Thursday this week, and then I'll have it out in a couple of weeks after that. This one is a follow-up to Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, and going through it. And I went back through The Color of Law a little bit before that, several of the chapters, and then also I've been reading Leah and Richard's new book, and it's just really cool. It's really fascinating. It's not cool because it's all about racism and the problems that we have with segregation in the United States from a housing perspective, from a land use perspective, but it's really, really interesting and fascinating to read. Anthony Flint from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy is coming on to talk about his book Mayor's Desk, where he interviewed mayors from around the country and talked to them about all the things that are happening in their cities. Looking forward to chatting with Anthony about that. Anthony's a longtime supporter of the newsletter, as well as at the Lincoln Institute is doing lots of great work always about land policy around the country and the world. Host of KQED's Forum, Alexis Madrigal, will be with us on the show to talk about his book, The Pacific Circuit. And I told him this at the end of the show, at the end of the recording anyways. The show will come out in a couple of weeks, but I told him this. I think this book is more important than Abundance and the discussion that's happening around that book. And I know that there's a huge amount of discussion happening around that book, Abundance, by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. And I haven't read it yet. I've just, I've covered so much news and I've gone through so many articles that I understand what's in it, obviously, for the most part. But this book by Alexis, oh my gosh, it's just amazing how it connects all the dots from World War II, even before that, and kind of talks about segregation. I mean, it kind of builds on The Color of Law and makes it real in a neighborhood, and just covers from here to there about the Port of Oakland and the truck pollution and all the things that happen there, and why people in that neighborhood have been left behind for so long. And so the reason why I think that's really important is because it connects all these dots about how some folks weren't given a fair shake, and how we continue to perpetuate ills of the past and not really realizing it. And so the history combined with the understanding of what's happening, I think that's just a really powerful story, and I hope folks get a chance to read the book and listen to the show as well when it comes out. So I'm looking forward to sharing that discussion with you all. It was really great. Bill Schultes of Tool Design will be coming on as well to talk about the NACTO and AASHTO bike guides and how they stack up against each other. Thanks again, Ryan, for pushing that one. I mentioned that last time, but really excited to have Bill on. Kevin Kryzak is going to be back on the show too. I've got some other books lined up. I'm looking on my shelf right now. What do I have up there? I have Planning for the Caring City, which was written by a couple of New Zealand scholars, which I'm really looking forward to reading and getting back to with those. I have some other books on here that I might read, I might not read. I don't know. It just depends on whether I have time or not. Reading a book a week is it's a little overwhelming. But yeah, I try because hopefully you guys like the books, and hopefully you enjoy the discussions that we have about them and the connections that we make. I actually had a thread that I put up on Blue Sky yesterday connecting the dots from the number of shows that we've done over the last 2 months or so, and there's been a lot of great shows and a lot of really interesting discussions, and I just really appreciate how most shows when I talk with folks, I'm like, oh yeah, this is you're talking about this, and you discuss this like this book that we read and the author that we had on the show. And so I love how they're all connected, how they weave into each other, especially this this connection between Alexis's book and Leah and Richard Rothstein's book. I mean, those two are connected, obviously. Alexis references The Color of Law several times in his book, but just having those together and talking with Stacey Mitchell and having Yoni Applebaum on and even Yona Freemark and Kyle and everybody come on the show to talk about all these things. They're all connected, and it's good to weave the story together in one big narrative. So I love that about this. Thanks to everybody who's ordered the Bus and Bike scarves. You guys are awesome. And if you'd like to order one, you can go to theoverheadwire.com, or you can email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you want a bunch of them. The bike-only knit scarves are back in stock. We have them. We've been sending them out. People have been ordering them. We really appreciate that. And as we always note, we want to thank everybody for supporting the show, whether that's on Patreon, patreon.com/theoverheadwire, or buying books off the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. You can also support us by going to that bookshop site and then ordering any book you want. There's been a lot of orders lately of books that we haven't had on the show, which is great. So, and somebody actually ordered. I saw this the other day. Somebody ordered Alexis's book before we even talked about that we were going to have it on the show. So that's awesome too. So I'm glad people are going on there and ordering. And every time you order on a bookshop through our shop, we get a $1 or $2 for each purchase. So that helps us out a lot. Also, the Cars Are Cholesterol t-shirts and merch are still there and kicking. I have been sending the Cars Are Cholesterol stickers with folks who order scarves, and so I've been sending those out, and hopefully folks get a kick out of that. If you want to follow Richard Wozensky, who designed the Cars Are Cholesterol logo, you can do so on Instagram at Dick David Sketches. He's over there doing some really cool stuff always. bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol if you want to get any of that merch. We also strongly suggest that folks sign up for the newsletter. Obviously, that's where most of our work is, and fuels this show, Mondays at the Orbit Wire. So if you want to support that, go for it too. We've had a lot of folks signing up. We had a dip in subscriptions, some retirements and stuff, and then people have been picking up the slack. So if you want to join in, feel free to do so. We've got a really great archive of over 100,000 items that you can search by topic and city. I had some emails back and forth with folks asking who are members to ask to be the librarian today and look through some of the archival stuff. And that was great to help people out in their research and their work. So if you need anything, if you need to look for anything, find anything on any subjects, really appreciate that. Thanks to everybody who listens, and let's get to the show you're waiting for. This is episode 168. We're live and in session. And before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts. and Talking Headways, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Cast, and of course, Apple Podcast. Thanks to everybody who subscribes to the podcatchers. You're probably listening to this show right now because you're on a podcatcher and you have it in your feed. It's awesome that you guys keep coming back to the show. We really do appreciate it. Also, if you're so inclined, leave us a review on iTunes. We had a review recently discussing how there's advertising in iTunes for other shows. And yes, there is advertising in iTunes for other shows, which you can skip if you become a Patreon member. But usually the second one in our feed is another show, which is something that we've been trying out from an advertising perspective. And actually, the rates are actually much higher than than the advertisements for cars or for Amazon or whatever at the beginning from Libsyn. So it's actually been helping us out. But if you want to skip that, go to patreon.com/thearrowheadwire, and we have an ad-free feed for you. So you can sign up there. The news. There's so much news, so much interesting news. There's been so much stuff going on. In DC, we talked with Rick Larson, congressman and ranking member on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee recently about some of the stuff that's going on there. A lot of the stuff that we talk about, or we're going to talk about, has not much to do with what's going on in Washington, what's going on, the craziness that's going on with the current administration, and so or the tariffs or anything like that. But it is interesting urbanism news, transportation policy. It is, some of it's tangential, but we don't go into the other stuff too much. And I'm actually kind of glad sometimes, because I do, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I do get a little bit overwhelmed by it because I'm swimming in it every day, and sometimes it gets me down a little bit. So what we're going to cover today is some of the top news that folks were interested in from the newsletter. Let's get started. States shifting road funds into sustainable transportation. As the federal government pulls back from funding active and green transportation, some states are stepping up. Colorado and Minnesota are already integrating strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled in their highway policies, while others outside the initial network are pursuing their own local sustainability goals. This was by Jeff McMurray in the Associated Press. So there's a group that's getting together and trying to push the states to focus on active transportation because the federal government is trying to pull back on it. So hopefully we can get more stuff going that way and locally than from the federal transportation funding process, because it looks like they're trying to pull back. So this is good from the advocates. It's good to see what the states are already doing. Obviously, we had folks from Minnesota on to talk about their policy. Colorado's been doing their thing, but other states are doing stuff as well. There's I think actually Montana and some other states are doing some stuff to get local transportation policy enacted, even though it's not coming from the feds. So really cool stuff. Brooklyn apartments put together like Legos, like Lego. You know what? This is funny. I had an editor, I think at Greater Washington, because this is where a lot of these go, and I do a Friday article for them that's a best of, and some of that stuff comes back into here in the newsletter, in the Monday show, I should say. And you're not supposed to say Legos with with an S. It's just Lego, put together like Lego. So somebody edited that, and I should tell them that that's a thing. The Lego community does not frowns upon using Legos for some reason. I don't know why. It doesn't really matter, honestly, but it's kind of funny. An affordable housing project in Brooklyn used 60-foot pre-built units to create 57-unit 4-story building in just 2 weeks. The prefabricated approach cut construction time by 8 months. Designed to be passive house standard, the building is highly energy efficient. This was by Adele Peters in Fast Company. This is interesting. There's more technology companies coming on the scene in terms of building materials and stuff, and these modular units that these groups are building are getting more and more sophisticated. And they put, for this one specifically, I read in the article that they basically put together the whole unit inside, and they take all the appliances and they tape them up against the wall so that when they're moving them with the crane and stuff, they don't jiggle around and move. So everything's pre-built, and it actually reduced their time from I think it was 28 weeks or something, 29 weeks to 22 weeks, something like that. So that was really interesting to hear how they're doing that and putting that together and starting to prefab buildings way faster. Lack of state capacity. David Schleicher and Nicholas Bagley argue that while debates on government capacity often focus on the federal level, the real issue lies with state and local governments. These are the levels of government that provide most of the services and infrastructure that people rely on, and therefore reform should start there and not just in Washington. This is by the Niskanen Center, by David Schleicher and Nicholas Bagley in the Niskanen Center. Super interesting on this one too, because what happened was there's been a lot of discussion about government capacity, and especially, we talked about Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book Abundance lately, and they, I'm sure, chat about that because they've talked about it in their articles before. But David has been working on this for a while, and we had him on the show to talk about his book, and thinking about like bonds and infrastructure policy and those types of things. But this capacity issue, where we're learning from some of the research that's happened, and some of the research I think we talked about last time on the Monday show, actually, where the capacity is being reduced. And so highway costs, for example, for paving are taking more. And so we've talked about this from a transit perspective, where we need to have more folks in state government, in local government, to bird dog the consultants and stuff, to make sure that the costs stay low. Because if you don't, then the costs go higher, the prices go higher, and it's harder to build miles of transit or miles of roads. But this should really start at the local and state level for sure. Because the federal government, yes, we need capacity there, and we're losing capacity there for dumb reasons now. But there is a necessity to build up locally. And I think a lot of times when budget cuts come up, there's not an understanding that those short-term budget cuts where you can get a little money have long-term repercussions on the budgets of building roads and building infrastructure. So I think that's the trade-off that we're talking about. More roads go pedestrian in Paris. Residents of Paris, France, voted to pedestrianize 500 more streets in a low turnout election with about 4% participation. Since the current party took power in around 2000, traffic has been cut in half, and the city has held multiple votes on urban quality of life, including a recent decision to triple SUV parking rates. The referendum also calls for removing 10,000 more parking spaces, doubling the number already eliminated since 2020. So they've eliminated 20,000 parking spaces in Paris. I think it was Scott Feeney, who's a prolific San Francisco area poster on Mastodon as well as Blue Sky, talking about how he's not a big fan of congestion pricing. And one of the things he points to is what's happening in Paris. And they've not done congestion pricing, obviously, but what they have done is really restricted vehicles in the center of the city. And it's really, driven down, pollution. It's driven down the drivers. It's driven down VMT. And it's another way that if you can get those policies through and you can make it work, and as another alternative to congestion pricing to get to the same end. I think it's harder to do some of that stuff without a really strong government that's been there for a long time and has the same people in power for a long time to keep that stuff going and make sure it's perpetuated. Congestion pricing just seems a little easier from a just like, hey, let's set this up and then let it rip. And then everybody finds out how good it works right away. So there's a kind of two ways to do it. But this is one of the things that's happening in Paris is they're, pedestrianizing streets. They're taxing SUVs for their parking. They're really doing a good job of building bike lanes, building infrastructure for active transportation. They build the Grand Paris Express to do suburban transit and expansion that way. So two different ways to think about it. Battery fires spark opposition. A recent fire at a large-scale battery grid at Moss Landing, California, is being used as ammunition against other battery storage projects around the country. The plant was completed before several updates to safety standards, and the long-term public health of environmental damages are still unknown. So what's interesting about this specifically is that the Moss Landing had a fire for some batteries that were basically storing solar power that was being generated during the daytime, and they were using the batteries to generate power for homes at night. Obviously because solar doesn't actually work in nighttime. So what's interesting about this is specifically that they've, since that time when they installed that, it was one of the first installations of a large battery pack for storage in that way, and they've actually had a bunch of more safety standards since then to reduce fires and reduce the impacts of fires. But this one was built early on, and so when it went up in flames, it actually caused a lot of problems in terms of the amount of emissions that were given out from the fire, and they found some heavy metals in the ground, and in the area. Moss Landing specifically is where a lot of produce is grown around that area. I've actually been to Moss Landing a couple times to kayak with my sister, which was really fun. But so there's a lot of strawberries around there, a lot of broccoli, a lot of kind of those types of plants for food, and it's a really major growing area. And so I'm really worried actually about what happens when some of these fires take off. There's people who had health impacts. There's people who have basically like felt like they were smelling heavy metals, tasting heavy metals in the air in the area. And so I hope that they do some testing on the soils and continue to find out what happened. I'm glad that safety measures have been improved, but this is one of the things that we do need to think about if we're going to have these batteries that are going to store energy when solar and other alternatives are making energy and then can't work at certain times of the day or certain times of the night, and just can't go 24 hours like the system that exists now. I don't think we should stop developing battery packs and things. Like the people who basically were using this incident to oppose batteries in parts in the eastern part of the country. But I do think this is something we should pay attention to, because it is something that could cause problems down the line. An e-bike transformed her life. After spending hours in traffic to get her daughter to school, Elizabeth Endicott took the plunge and bought an e-bike. The switch transformed her commute, allowing her and her family to cut through traffic, arrived at their destination sweat-free, and gained something unexpected, a deeper connection with each other and their neighborhood on their morning rides. This was by Elizabeth Endicott in The Atlantic. Heard lots of people talk about e-bikes this way. They really enjoy the feeling that they get, but also the time when they get with their kids, driving with their kids. You're in the car. They may or may not be paying attention to what's going on, but maybe when they're on the bike, you have the situation where they're learning kind of the directions and things are happening. We find that kids that are driven around more often than not have really bad mapping skills in their brains, really bad navigational skills. And so that's maybe one way to work it out, but also just spending time and going down maybe some pathways instead of on the road might be a more pleasant experience. The user pay myth. Transportation has always been funded by various sources, yet there is a persistent belief that users should pay directly. This user pay myth wasn't even true just 3 years into the Highway Trust Fund's existence, as it failed and needed congressional support to stay solvent. Dave Cook argues that this myth should be put to bed because public investment in transportation should be about getting people to destinations rather than supporting drivers. Dave Cook in the Union of Concerned Scientists. We talk about this a lot, the user pay myth and how much transportation is funded from user fees is so negligible. The idea that mostly property taxes and other taxes fund transportation around the country, but people think that their gas taxes are the only thing that pay for transportation policy, but it's not true. So it comes up a lot when we're talking about bikes, specifically in cities that are like, we want to register and tax bikes, have them register, basically pay a registration fee or whatever. Obviously, those people are paying property taxes in one way or another, and are maybe basically the funding that comes up for that was negligible in terms of how much they raise. And so it's interesting to hear from folks who think that they don't pay their fair share, even though they may pay more than their fair share when it comes to the transportation policy stuff. So it's just something that's been happening for a long time and that we really need to think about a little harder and persuade people that that's actually the case, versus thinking that the user pay method is always kind of what it was. Because as you heard from the story that Dave told, basically the Highway Trust Fund has never really been solvent, and it's funded through gas tax, and the gas tax now hasn't been raised since 1991, and so inflation has really eaten into that as well. Taxing municipal bonds. Republicans in Congress are weighing a plan to eliminate the tax-free status of municipal bonds to offset tax cuts, which could drive up borrowing costs for cities. Since 80% of infrastructure funding comes from state and local sources, and bonds are a key financing tool, this change could strain budgets. As Susan Crawford points out, it could also make climate adaptation projects more expensive and subject to the whims of private credit markets. This was the Tax Policy Center, as well as Susan Crawford in Moving Day. So the Republicans in Congress want to basically eliminate the tax-free status of bonds, which are basically, as David Schleicher points out in his book, is one of the ways that America has gotten way ahead of European countries is because we have this ability to raise money to build infrastructure. And while they build a lot more bikes and transit lanes and stuff like that, we've built so much infrastructure in the United States. Well, maybe it's good that actually we we might cut that out. We won't build stuff willy-nilly, but ultimately it's a way that we've actually built a lot of infrastructure, including electrical infrastructure as well as water infrastructure as well. So it's not just transportation policy, but it is interesting that they might try to basically take the tax-free status away for people who own bonds. In order to fund tax cuts. Are cities all becoming the same? Debate rages on about different styles of architecture and what constitutes beauty. Should cities emphasize classical forms or lean into modernist minimalism? Critics argue that the minimalist style has led to homogeneous cities and can be found anywhere. Others argue that classical architecture carries political baggage. Perhaps a mix of styles is the way forward to reduce the loss of cultural and social identity. This was by Lorenzo Villa in NSS Magazine. So there's a discussion obviously going on about classical architecture and what that means. I personally don't think that we really need to focus only on classical architecture. Some modern architecture is good, some modern architecture is bad, some classical architecture I couldn't care for, but it's something that we should just kind of build. I don't want to have the argument about what kind of architecture it is. Just build housing, build libraries, build stuff, and build it to quality so that it lasts. It doesn't matter what it's designed like, as long as it works well, and if it's good urban form, and if it is eyes on the street and all the other stuff that we care about, that's good. So sometimes I wonder why people care so much about design. People's design styles are all going to be different, and what they care about is going to be different. But in the end, it's how it shapes humans that matters. Designed forests. In an interview for his book, Designed Forests, A Cultural History, Dan Handel explores how forests have been shaped by human design, uncovering deep connections between forestry, architecture, and cultural narratives. He also notes that personal experiences with nature often form our ideas on landscapes, whether natural or designed, and that can influence our cultural interactions with them. This was by Erska Skrull and Landzine. Just kind of an interesting article about this book, interview about this book. It's one that I was like, I saw this and I was like, maybe that'd be cool to read. And then I was like, no, off topic a little bit too much, maybe. Sometimes I get pulled that direction, but not this time. Maybe fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. Okay, a couple of bonus items for folks. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers' budget proposal includes a change in state law that would allow for the creation of regional transit authorities with their own taxing authorities. Milwaukee County Transit System has never had a dedicated revenue source and is operating with a structural deficit. This was by Urban Milwaukee, one of our good friends. So if they get a regional transit agency, I know that they fight over transit funding all the time. So it would be great to have a dedicated source of revenue as well as a transit agency that can serve the whole region. That'd be great. In Leuven, Belgium, plans to reduce emissions by 2050 include the recycling of buildings by urban miners. As part of the city's circular strategy, workers and volunteers take buildings apart piece by piece in order to find what can be used again. This was in The Guardian. That's cool. Like, take apart buildings. When we were doing our basement, we reused some of the doors that we found down here from the original house, some 1890s doors. Now, it didn't cost any less because we had to refinish them and paint them and all that stuff, but reusing material that you already have, that's really good. Actually, we also had some redwood posts that were taken out to redo the structural basement of the house for earthquake retrofit, and I'm gonna get those posts back. I'm still waiting for them to come back. They're in a storage space somewhere, but there's some redwood posts that I'm gonna reuse at some point for something. And so taking buildings apart, let's reuse as much as possible if possible. The CEO of Amtrak has stepped down at the request of Donald Trump after attacks on the organization from both the transportation secretary and Trump henchman Elon Musk. Musk, in his usual cognitive dissonance, has floated privatizing the railroad while praising China's publicly funded and operated high-speed rail system. This was in the Associated Press. I don't need to go there, but basically, those guys, they don't know anything about transportation, so why should we listen to them? After the conflagration in Altadena, California, homeowners and architectural historians are racing to preserve historic tiles from fireplaces that, in some instances, were the only things left standing. Removing tiles before looters is important because some individual ones can go for thousands of dollars. This was in the New York Times. Really interesting. Yeah, if you look at those burned out charred remains of the houses in Altadena and Pacific Palisades, I think, mostly Altadena though, There's just the fireplace, and then there's those tiles on the fireplace, which are historic because they were built in the 20s and 30s. And so people are trying to save them so they can put them in their new houses when they rebuild, which I think is really cool. Sacramento will vote Tuesday whether to establish a quick build program to make dangerous roads more safe. The program would allow the construction of safety measures possible in just a few months instead of years or decades. This is in the Sacramento Bee. Yeah, so this is really interesting that they're thinking about doing this thing where they can make emergency changes to streets if there's a lot of safety issues. And I think that that's a great idea. Just put it in and don't argue about it. If you know what makes something safe, just do it and make sure that you put it in. Argue about it later. Sound Transit is moving towards making former King County executive and current board member Dow Constantine the CEO of the agency. The nomination has been questioned on whether it represents a conflict of interest, as half the board was nominated by Constantine in his capacity as executive. Others note that while he doesn't have the transit agency or operations experience, he will know more about the internal workings of the agency than other candidates. This was in the Urbanist. Yeah, it seems like a conflict of interest when you nominate half of the board that votes for you for the CEO. I don't know what other folks think about this, but it seems to smack of problems. Also, basically giving yourself a job because you're leaving another job, seems a little bit much, but I don't know. We'll see. He has to prove himself, I guess, now and make sure that he does everything right. I hope they can actually get ST3 going and build some of those lines that they've been promising. So when I was every week when I do the newsletter, I write a little bit for the intros of maybe two of the newsletters a week. I can't do it every day because it's hard to generate that much content in writing, but I try to take some of the articles that I think are interesting and pull them together into more of a narrative. And then I post them as the intro to the newsletter, which I send out to subscribers every day, or I also put them on our Substack as well. It's just kind of like little pieces, maybe like 5-6 paragraphs long. So this one I wrote about San Francisco, and I wanted to share this one because I know there's been a lot of negative news lately, but I want to cover some of the positive stuff. So I just wanted to read this out to you all and kind of as an understanding of what I've been trying to think about lately. So I know where I live, San Francisco, is easy to pick on. Our leaders can sometimes do dumb stuff and vote for things that seem to the rest of the country like they're out of touch. Our new mayor just bought himself an electric SUV and gave it to the city so he could use it. He was seen on his e-bike during the campaign trail, but in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder why they can't take Muni more often and mix more with us plebes. We even get it from our allies. In today's news, an item from one of my favorite current thinkers, Yale law professor David Schleicher, on the crisis of state capacity, noted that some of the city's rougher neighborhoods and their tent encampments and potholes, and the juxtaposition of some of the big technology things that are happening here. Yes, those things are here and in every major city, but folks that have come to visit me in my neighborhood sometimes seem surprised at how different the national news coverage is from what they see. Admittedly, it's a nice neighborhood, but I should also note that some of the positive things that happen because it can't be all negative all the time. My street was repaved just a few years ago, and crews are just finishing up laying asphalt on our main commercial street, which has been battered by buses, tech versions, and Muni. The whole neighborhood has gotten new sewer pipes and now has smooth roads, which I love when I'm out on my bike going downhill. The repavings are so quick. Just a few days they are done. The main commercial street took a few weeks, but they also put in new ADA ramps and concrete pads for the bus stops. No one is going to talk about how great an outcome that is, but it is an example of good execution by our city. Additionally, for all the complaints about how long it takes to build multifamily housing, I found making a basement addition really easy with the right contractor and architects. Thank you, OpenScope Studio. That could bird dog everything and get approvals in the same afternoon they walked into the permit office. We knew to avoid anything that would bring us to design review or any of the onerous processes that the city is known for, but we designed it that way on purpose. And it should be that easy for everyone without scripting the process to avoid pain. It took 10 months for construction, and it was done. Many of the houses on my street made additions that went to design review, and it took years. But it just tells me that a better outcome is possible. And finally, San Francisco is known as a city with small numbers of children. But you wouldn't know it if you went to the local baby playground daily and talked with the unofficial mayor of the space, a grandpa who takes his care of his grandson during the day and knows everyone. Or if you're at Town Square, a former parking lot turned public space and the home of the infamous expensive toilet in Noe Valley, on a warm afternoon after kids get out from daycare and parents can decompress from work, there's stuff going on. The place is teeming with life and giggling and children and wonder until dinner time. Or getting on the 24 bus at Geary and missing one because it's so full of high schoolers. It's okay though. The next one came in 5 minutes. I could go on about San Francisco's natural beauty, its weather, food, and all the other things you all know already about. But there's so much more that people don't hear about because it's boring and not controversial. Do we have issues, and are they big ones? Yes. Housing, homelessness, cost of living. But we also have successes and wins, and sometimes I wish we'd share more of them wherever we come from. Also, some news out of North Carolina. State senators are introducing a bill that would create a regional transit agency in Charlotte, which would replace the city-county agency CATS. The bill comes as legislators are also moving forward a bill that would approve a sales tax measure that would allow a vote to increase funding for transit in the region. Matched with federal monies, the tax measure would fund capital transit expansion through 40% of the funding will likely be required for road spending. But now there's a twist. Republican Charlotte City Council member Tariq Bokhari has been tapped to be the Federal Transit Administration's deputy administrator. Bokhari voted against purchasing a freight right-of-way for commuter rail, has promoted autonomous vehicles, and had asked Elon Musk's Boring Company to meet with local leaders about transit expansion in the region. It's likely the future of the region's transit funding is now tied to him. And finally, electric vehicle company Rivian is spinning off a company developing electrification solutions for smaller vehicles and micromobility. The company named Also, the name is actually called Also, ALSO, will be developing everything in-house, including motors and software for scooters, e-bikes, and golf cart-sized vehicles. This was in Heatmap. Okay, that's a lot of news. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. This week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going, but listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without you, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you a bus-only or bike-only scarf. You also get access to ad-free episodes of this podcast, Mondays at the Overhead Wire, and Talking Headways as they come in the feed. Also, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1901 classic, Town Planning and Practice, and if you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. You can also check it out through Libby, which is from your public library. The book was fun to produce, and if you're a History of Planning fan, it's the first one listed on the American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. Listener questions and comments. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to email us or write at any of the social sites where the podcast appears. If you have any questions, shoot them over to theoverheadwire@gmail.com. And finally, Puppies and Butterflies is part of the show where we're talking something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. I'm waiting on Andor. I'm looking forward to that show so much. Been watching a lot of home improvement shows and stuff like that. Been watching Hometown Takeover. And that show's really interesting. And they go into a city, a small town, and they revitalize it, renovate a lot of buildings, renovate a lot of houses. This time they're in Sebring, Florida. They're revitalizing the circle that's the center of the city that was bypassed by the highway. Typical story in America. In the other cities that they talked about too, I think the last one in Fort Morgan, Colorado, that was another problem, is the highway went around the city. And just it's just interesting how the transportation policy impacts the redevelopment of our places, the vibrancy of our places, stuff like that. But I've been waiting for Andor. The Star Wars is in me. So really looking forward to that. Send me some of your puppies and butterflies. If folks have anything that they want to share that's fun or interesting, or maybe not transportation related, fun stuff, let me know. Okay, so you can find me on Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, Instagram, sometimes Threads, Substack, YouTube, and of course my website, and in your inbox every morning if you sign up for the newsletter, and on Flickr as Transit Nerds. Everything else is at The Overhead Wire. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. We'll see everybody next time.
Talking